Okay. Great. How's everybody doing today?
Doing good.
Doing good. Just for those of you that I haven't met a little bit more officially, my name is Dave Ong. I'm actually the Senior Director for Talent Acquisition here at Maximus. Very excited to be back on the campus of Northeastern University. It's been, I think, more than a few months at this point since I've been back in Boston. As I mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Talent Acquisition, which is basically just a very fancy title for somebody who recruits for a living. I've been at Maximus now for about 15 years, and amongst other things, I actually oversee the book of recruiting business related primarily to campus recruiting. So I actually have a campus recruiting team that covers the globe these days. We actually do domestic United States recruiting at about 130 to 150 different campuses around the country. We also have recruiting programs that have been lifting off in England, Australia, Canada, and in Italy in the last year or so, and probably more to come. And we're going to talk about that global perspective in just a little bit. In more recent years, in the last 2 years in particular, I've actually been overseeing all of our diversity and inclusion hiring. So I have teams of folks that do traditional diversity hiring. We have a team that does veterans hiring. We have a team that does disabilities hiring. And I'm also overseeing all of our recruitment branding efforts. Prior to joining Maximus 15 years ago, my recruitment background was primarily in the campus recruiting space. So I've actually managed campus recruiting programs at companies like Citigroup Corporate Investment Bank in New York, Capital One in Richmond, Virginia, and most recently with a major defense contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton in the DC area. And then on I guess on the days that I'm not working or at evenings that I'm not working, I also have some other jobs sort of related to the campus recruiting space. I've spent about 4 years on the leadership team for the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which oversees campus recruiting efforts both for internship, co-op, and full-time hires in terms of setting policy and promoting the hiring of students from universities into these types of positions. So that's basically all about me. LaDon, you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, sir?
Well, I'm LaDon Weatherly. I'm the Senior HR Manager for Maximus Asset location here in Boston. We're located at 55 Summit. I joined the company last year in November. Previously, I was working for FinFin. It's we call a human services organization that provide mental health services to the community. In fact, in Virginia, that was for 8 years that provided kids for the Job Corps centers for them to learn civic trade, and we provided counseling for them to find jobs in the communities. Virginia, back in 2015.
You want to do a quick intro around the room and on the campus? Do you want to start, Andy?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think most of you know me. Communicating back and forth. Andy McCarty, Director of CAVS. Very happy to have Maximus here with us today. They've been great supporters, partners, coming to speak to groups of students, but also 4-Block, for those of you who've been through 4-Block. They've been supporting that program for a couple of years. So really happy to have them here today to kind of lift the hood and tell you more about their organization and why they want.
Want to go around the room? How about that?
So hello everyone, my name is Hendrik Visser. I just finished up my master's in analytics here at Northeastern, and I'm in the transition period to kind of find something full-time now.
Okay, great.
So.
We got plenty to talk about, so.
My name is Chris Blunt. I'm graduating in December with a bachelor's in political science and business administration. I just finished up a co-op actually last Thursday with Johnson.
Great.
I'll be done in.
Perfect.
Furlong, I worked at for an academic advisor programs at CPS and also secondary advisor for any veterans here. Actually, originally came to work here. The grad through Maximus. Already, good advocate for you.
You're welcome.
And,
and thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Brian Masterson. I am stationed, I'm still active duty. I stationed up here in Boston to help run the Navy ROTC program. Northeastern is one of our schools. We have 6 schools here that we run. I'm the executive officer or chief operating officer, if you will. I will be retiring from the Navy here in about 10 days.
Oh, wow.
And,
Congrats.
yeah, thanks. And then we're shifting colors, and we're excited to be here. We want to stay in the New England area,
Okay,
so we're pretty happy to be here.
great. Good for you. And how about the folks on the phone? Can we figure out a way to get them to introduce themselves? Let's see. Give us a second while we figure out the technology here.
I guess I can start with me. My name is Sam Park. I am enrolled in the MBA program here at Northeast. I currently work as the Director of Operations for a insurance and tax and finance assistance agency. Just here to get some more information about the company.
Terrific. Welcome virtually. Who else is on there? How about Mike? I see Mike plugged in there. We'll do this a little bit of order.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hey, Mike.
Okay, my name is Mike Saunders. I am going to be graduating in December. My primary background, I did my undergrad at Emerson College, but I kind of see myself in a position where I really want to work either with the VA or in some capacity with veteran outreach or anything in that realm. So that's what kind of interested me about your company when I got the email.
Great. We will also have plenty to talk about. So that's fantastic. Thanks, Mike. Let's see who we get. Nick.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Mills. I'm actually the project manager for veteran recruiting for Maximus. I work with Dave is my boss. I'm retired military, 28 plus years in the Air Force. I've been with Maximus now for about little over 13 years, until about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was working in operations for a number of different projects for Maximus, and I took over the project manager for veteran recruiting about a year and a half ago. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you on what you're looking for and how we might be able to help.
Great. Thanks, Nick. How's things in San Antonio today?
Yeah, it's hot.
Yeah. Surprise, surprise. So, and I think last but not least, I think Yanal. Yanal, can you hear us okay? Might be muted. Give him a second. Maybe he's a little shy on the phone. Who knows? So. Okay. Yep. But I don't think we can hear him, I guess. Yanal, can you hear us okay? Can you nod if you can hear us? Okay, got it. Okay. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, so I apologize. So we're going to have to figure out a way to get you connected in the next couple minutes. But I just want to make sure you can hear all the presentation material. So you want to switch back to the material for now? So one of the things I love to do when I start these types of programs out, I'm just kind of curious that other than receiving emails or announcements about Maximus being on campus and what we're doing in regards to the veterans recruiting space, have any of you heard of Maximus in any type of form not related to the employment space?
Nope.
Is through here.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Nal. You want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah. So first it's Yanai.
Oh, Yanai. I'm sorry. I'm reading his Y-A-N-A-L on the screen, so I apologize. So.
It's an I. It's a little I. It's not an L. So I just graduated with the Master's in Homeland Security last month. I'm kind of looking, not really looking for an opportunity. I mean, if something presents itself, I'll probably be interested, but I'm not actively seeking or applying to any positions. I'm just seeing what's out there and seeing if something's fitting. I have some mobility issues and some, let's put it, it's all veterans, so leaving the house issues.
Right.
So I'm trying to find something that's suitable for both parties. So I'm looking, but
And we have a lot of opportunities that actually are kind of aimed in that area. Nick and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing that are kind of a little bit more outside the box in terms of how we hire and how we make adjustments and accommodations for certain individuals. So we're going to have plenty to talk about in this presentation as well. So,
Can I just
okay.
add,
Yeah.
Good.
for those who are joining online, if you would, there should be a little speaker, a little microphone icon. If you could just mute yourselves unless you want to chime in and you have a question, but that way we don't get any background noise.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Yanai. So I mentioned before, it's fairly typical, believe it or not, for people to come in these presentations and not know anything about Maximus. And quite frankly, we sort of like it that way. It means we're actually doing our job correctly, because if you've done some research about the organization, you're probably aware of the fact that we provide professional services primarily in the areas related to program management and consulting, mainly for government agencies both in the domestic United States and globally. All right, now, those services we're providing, you're looking at program management, which is essentially the privatization of existing government operations. We're going to talk very much in depth about that over the next 6-7 slides or so. But this idea that a government agency can take some type of typically back office operations and outsource them to a company like Maximus. I'm going to use the evil O word, outsource. But it is something that we're finding to be much more common in government these days. And it's something that's really helped us grow our book of business, in particular in the last 10 years or so. The other area that we focus on is consulting. So we've got a suite of different consulting services, both in the Health and Human Services segment that focus on things like modernizing programs, providing financial service support, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more in depth as well. We have gotten to be a pretty big company, believe it or not. And I say that because I joined 15 years ago. We were probably looking at revenues in the ballpark of about $400 million a year when I first joined, and we may have had about 3,000 employees at the time. You can see from this slide that we were founded 45 plus years ago. We've got now I think we're going to clear 37,000 employees by the time we get to the end of this fiscal year in October, which is just staggering to me being in recruiting, how seeing those numbers grow over the last few years. And a lot of that's been organic growth. A lot of it's also been growth by acquisition, in particular in the last 6 months. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our history slide. You can see from a revenue standpoint, we're about $2.4 billion in fiscal year 2018. When our fiscal year ends in 2019, which is basically in about another 2-3 months or so, we're expecting to report revenue somewhere in the ballpark of about $3 billion plus. So also something that's been quite staggering to watch. And if you take a look at our numbers on the New York Stock Exchange, we've been a publicly traded company for close to about 25, 30 years now. If you look at those numbers, that stock has been very aggressive, in particular in the last 10 years. So we've been very, very pleased by what we're seeing. Now, if all those being said, that's the standard boilerplate slide. But the thing I really love talking to folks about the most, particularly students, veterans, disabled populations, is making sure that you understand one of the things that makes us different from our competitors is the fact that we have a really unique mission. Has anybody heard of our mission or researched the mission at all? It's helping government serve the people. This notion that when we were founded by David Maestran, who was our original founding father and CEO of the organization, I'm going to tell an interesting David story as well, but he founded this organization on the idea that government does not do a good enough job of taking care of underserved populations. Families at risk, children at risk. That was really what was in his heart when he was thinking about building a company of his own. And I will tell you, just going back, since we're talking to veterans here, a lot of you might be interested in knowing that when David graduated from West Point, he was #1 in his class back in the late 60s. His major was industrial engineering and operations research. So instead of going off to war, he was actually drafted by Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration, whose job it was back then was to create what they call a Whiz Kids program, where he actually took the best folks, the best and brightest out of the military academies and put them to work in the federal government. And David was one of those first Whiz Kids. David's first job was working in agencies like the Department of Treasury, the Department of Health and Human Services, taking a look at the efficiency, or in many cases, the lack of efficiency that existed in terms of processing transactions in those types of agencies. After 4 or 5 years of doing that, he got inspired to create his own organization because he said, I will actually do a better job of fixing government if I do it from outside. felt very constrained by the very slow rate of change that exists in government. So that's really what inspired him to basically start up a company over his garage back in 1975. And about 12, 13 years later is when it really took off. That's when we kind of hit the idea of doing this program management and government outsourcing model. So neat connection with a really good connection to the military. So, all right, let's see. Let's go on to the next one here. I mentioned before we are a global organization, the largest amount of our business in the United States, but steadily in the last 7-8 years in particular, we've been really adding quite a few more countries to our list. Canada was the first place we went international, followed by Australia, then the UK, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore. And we've also played in Israel as well, but that contract ended about 7-8 years ago when there was a change in political power in Israel. I think it's important to note that when we've gone into these countries, the primary reason we moved into them is that we get asked to come in and take a look at their welfare to work program. The common link with all these countries, with the exception of Canada, is that countries felt that what we were doing in the welfare space was so unique that when these countries wanted to transform their own social welfare programs, they looked at what we were doing in a model in Wisconsin that we've been running now for about 25 years or so. They take that model and replicate it in these countries. And what we've been doing is actually what we call land and expand. We'll start off with welfare to work. We'll typically buy a competitor that does work in that space in these countries, and then we've helped them grow their books of businesses so much that we end up replicating the rest of Maximus in most of these. They're a pretty unique opportunity there as well. If you look at the verticals, about basically how we're divided as an organization, you really look at what I call 3 very distinct verticals. One being the Maximus US program, which is for healthcare and human services. Then we actually have the global perspective, the international segment, if you will, and then we're going to start with U.S. federal, which is the largest of our U.S.-based markets. This has been crazy to watch, quite frankly, because I'm not going to read off the slides so much. You guys can read on your own. What I think is important to note is that about 10 years ago, if you looked at our federal book of business, it was probably no more than about 15% of our overall business portfolio in terms of revenue. What happened 10 years ago is that we got a lot of feedback from agencies at the federal level, the ones we were already working with, such as the Social Security Administration, say, for example. They were telling us that you guys are so good at this back office operations work when it comes to healthcare and human services. But have you ever thought about taking some of those core competencies and putting them out to other agencies, putting the word out that there are all these different government agencies outside of health and human services that need the same type of help? So we got thinking in terms of how do we expand our federal practice accordingly. What is it we do well? We're going to talk about some of those services. It's in terms of running customer contact centers, say, for example, call center operations, both inbound and outbound. We're really good at processing documents. We're really good at determining eligibility for programs. Okay? Started taking a look at the market and realizing we have a really golden opportunity here.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, yes, of course. Sorry.
We can't see any slides online.
Oh, okay. Let's see. What do we got here, Andy?
So I don't know if you're showing something. We can't see anything from our side.
Yeah, we do. We've got 3 slides up. We've got 3 slides in here, so hold on.
Have it as an extended desktop, it might just might not be showing.
That's good, thanks.
I can see it now.
You can see it now? Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. And if you'd like, I can send this to Andy and he can actually distribute it so that you don't feel like you didn't miss any of those slides there. We'll make sure that gets out to you. So, okay. So if you look at the federal services overview, again, contact centers, document processing, enrollment eligibility, things like that. Those are all things that we consider to be our core competencies as an organization. We're trying to look to see how we actually push this out to various federal clients. And I mentioned before that we've had growth both from an organic standpoint, but also through acquisition. So what we've been doing in the last, in particular, 5 years or so, is we've been identifying opportunities for adjacent markets and new markets by looking at smaller organizations that we could acquire that already had a foothold in a number of the agencies we wanted to be working with. So if you kind of go to that next slide, you have to click on the slide itself, right? Give us a second, let's see. Are you folks on the phone? Are you able to see the slide now that says full service provider for U.S. federal agencies?
Dave, it's back to black.
Back to black, okay. There's always something with technology, huh?
How's that now?
No change.
Yeah, I still got nothing.
We may just,
Can we email them the presentation?
while you're going through it, you mean?
Yeah. Okay. So Andy's going to try and email the folks on the phone a copy of the presentation in the next minute or so. In the meantime, let me kind of just walk through what we're talking about in terms of being a full service provider for U.S. federal agencies. So for those of you that are on the phone, when you get the presentation in the next minute or so, you'll want to go to slide 6. What we're looking at here is basically a list of just some of the agencies with whom we've made inroads in the last 4 or 5 years by making some of these strategic acquisitions. Some of those organizations that we purchased, say, for example, about 3 years ago, we actually acquired an organization called Accenture, which does federal agency softwares, working with about 60 or 70 different government agencies. And we keep in mind of those 60 or 70, I think we only had relationships with 3 of them prior to making that acquisition. So it's one of those things that gets our name out to a wide variety of clients, say, for example, NOAA or the Department of Education, say, for example. And that was a pretty critical purchase right there. Getting connections with the Department of Education got us inroads into one of our largest federal contracts, which we picked up about 3 years ago, and that's doing student debt management. I'm sure as college students or recent graduates, a lot of you are familiar with the crisis that exists right now, and that students are taking out exorbitant loans to pay for education, but they're not getting the return on investment and are defaulting on loans at a record rate. So our federal practice runs 2 call centers, one in Pennsylvania, one in, Texas, if I remember correctly, that actually handles outbound calls to individuals that are showing signs of going bad on that student debt. And they provide counseling suggestions that will help them get through that short-term crisis. Okay, so that's just one of those ways that this type of connection got us an inroad to a contract that I think is worth something like $70 million a year, $80 million a year to us, if I remember correctly. It's a pretty big opportunity there. Another recent acquisition, this is actually much more recent, about 6 months ago, we actually doubled our domestic workforce by purchasing the federal call center practice for General Dynamics, so I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with. PDIT, as they're commonly known. They do a lot of defense work, a lot of government work, but they had a book of business particularly related to call centers on Obamacare open enrollment, which fits in our portfolio beautifully, and that as well as contracts in the education space. And their biggest one that they have coming up is they're going to be running the U.S. Census. So if you just look at numbers, say, for example, I mentioned before that we've got to be at about 37,000 employees by the end of the year, essentially. A lot of it's due to the census and Obamacare enrollment programs, which in the next 5 months, I believe we have to hire somewhere in the ballpark of about 10,000 employees. So kind of frightening from a recruitment standpoint right now. If I look like I'm not getting any sleep, there's a good reason, trust me. So, but hopefully this gives you an idea about just some of the federal business lines that we're currently in, and who knows where we're going to be going beyond there. Another very popular federal contract for us that I really should mention is the VA. Actually, Nick, do you want to talk a little bit, since I know you're on the phone, about the work that we've been doing for the VA for the last 3 or 4 years? Because Nick came from that project and has worked in that vertical now for a little while. Excuse me, Nick, you still on?
Yes, still here. Yeah, we started, as Dave said, a couple of years ago. I was on that original project with the CARE program through the VA, where we were actually helping the VA provide choice program. Helping veterans get to their medical appointments that the VA could no longer handle. We were involved with that for about 2 years, maybe a little longer than that. And once again, we're starting up another project dealing with the VA and helping the VA. And it's all about what we're doing, as Dave has been explaining all along, is we're doing that back office type of work that, as all of us veterans know, sometimes is where the stopping point or the place where it gets riled up before we can get our medical information and the things we need done from the VA. So that's really exciting when you're a veteran to be able to work with an organization, but we're working with the piece where we're actually talking and helping out the individual veterans. And I think out of about 800, 900 employees on the choice program, that when we were doing it, we had about 40 veterans that were working on that as well out of near Dallas a year or two ago. So it's pretty exciting to have veterans helping veterans.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. I know Andy's in the process of getting that presentation out to everybody. I'm going to go through a couple quick slides here. If you want to look at, yes, of course.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So are you, do you all like create processes?
We're basically running the programs on their behalf in most cases.
Okay.
So there are examples, if you look to our consulting business, where we're doing exactly what we were talking about. We'll actually take a look at process, turn it upside down, provide the fixes, and then we'll turn it back over to the government for them to oversee it. But that is a much smaller percentage of our business these days versus the program mix.
Dave, you mentioned around 37,000 employees.
Right.
What's the breakout for full-time employees versus part-time or seasonal?
Vast majority are full-time. We would like there to be a lot more part-time, to be honest with you. If you look at what my team has been working on, particularly on the disability space, we're finding that a large percentage of the individuals with disabilities that we're recruiting these days would like to be able to work part-time schedules when possible, because they don't want to lose their federal benefits, say, for example, by working too many hours.
Right.
So we've been making a lot of those accommodations there, particularly when it comes to some of the call center, case management jobs, some of the non-exempt hourly positions. But we would like to have a larger part-time workforce, quite frankly. Have a little bit more flexibility with the workforce as well.
And I would think with programs like the census that are coming up every 10 years,
right,
that you're going to have to grow to support, and then
you're going to be shrinking down. Right, correct. And if you look at some of these projects, Obamacare Open Enrollment is another example of that, where you're going to have a bulge in hiring for about 5 or 6 months or so. And then what we've been doing in the last couple of years, typically they would have to do mass layoffs at the end of these contracts. But what's been happening is that just with the job market being so competitive, you always need to keep staff ongoing for day-to-day maintenance of something like Obamacare. What we've been seeing is that since the job market is so competitive, natural attrition has actually taken care of most of that. So as long as the economy stays good, we don't anticipate the layoffs in these types of positions. With census, that is typically an 8-month job, if I remember correctly. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. It can be about a 9 to 12-month job, I think.
You should have a presentation.
Yes, okay. Folks on the phone, if you could check your emails and see if you've got access to the presentation. And when you do, we are on slide 7, looking at the Social Security Ticket to Work program. So this is something we started running almost 20 years ago. Our job is to work for the Social Security Administration, making sure that beneficiaries of SSA benefits are actually making the right choices in terms of potential employment. We kind of connect them to a network, potential employers and partners that we have all around the United States. So administering the ticket and making sure that the providers are getting accurate payments. Pretty cool project we've been doing, and I think it's something that really is very indicative of our mission, that helping government serve the people, working with individuals with disabilities. This is something we do both at the federal level, and then we do similar work in the welfare to work space at the domestic level, mainly for state and local governments. Okay. The next thing I thought would be interesting, I love this one, the workers' compensation issue. So in the state of California, we got hired by this federal practice to basically resolve the disputes for individuals that get hurt on the job. All right, so the workman's comp claims. Anybody ever here had to go through a workman's comp claim, just out of curiosity? Anybody been injured on the job in any type of position?
My brother's going through one right now in California.
Okay, so how is that going for him, just out of curiosity? Is it, how long has he been on, I guess, is the question.
He's been on it for about a year and a half now.
Okay.
They're trying to, so they're suing the insurance company for the company that he got hurt on while working, and so they had to wait for some reason for him to finish all of his medical treatments and physical therapy long after in order to get the bill and then try to finalize some kind of number to get compensated for, if that makes sense.
Which is an incredibly stressful situation for that individual, I would assume, correct?
Yes. So he just got back to work after like 9 months of not working.
Okay. Yeah. So our job is to take a look at cases like this. And what we do in this particular case is we hire doctors and nurses to review the cases. So in the United States, within federal government healthcare practices, if you are actually in dispute of a claim, say for example, you think the government made the wrong decision in certain medical areas. It could be something related to Medicaid or Medicare. It could be related to workman's comp, et cetera. The federal government has requirements that it's not going to be a government worker that reviews the case and makes the final decision once the dispute is made. It has to go to an independent medical reviewer. The Maximus hires doctors and nurses primarily as consultants, primarily part-time, that actually review all these cases and make the decision as to how the claim should have been handled in the first place. I think we've looked into that. Nick, do you know, have we done that same thing for veterans? I don't know if we've done it for VA as of yet, but I think there have been discussions around that, to be honest with you. Okay, but you can take a look at, say, for example, how we've cut the cycle time by about almost 15-20%. We're able to figure out how much quicker we can process these claims. And you can look at the number of people that have been affected by this just in the state of California over the last year and a half or so. This is actually a fairly new contract for us. Okay? So that's an example of some things we do at the federal level. Okay? Let's talk about health and human services. I'll chat a little bit about human services. You can see on the bottom of this slide, for those of you on the phone, the services that we provide in the social services or human services arena focus on things like welfare to work, which I sort of mentioned before. If any of you study or know much about the welfare space in the United States, you might know that about 20 plus years ago, back in the Clinton era, toward the end of Bill Clinton's reign as president, he actually partnered with Tommy Thompson, the governor of the state of Wisconsin, to create a new welfare reform model. If you were looking at welfare programs 20 years ago, you knew there was a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, getting more bad press than it was good press. They were trying to figure out ways to fix that. So Clinton worked with his little buddy, Tommy Thompson, who actually sat on our board for about 15 years, as a matter of fact. It was really neat to meet him a couple times. But they actually created this model that says if you're going to get a welfare check, you've got to convince us that you're doing everything you can to get off of welfare. And they chose to model that in the state of Wisconsin. They needed a strategic partner to run the day-to-day operations, and they chose Maximus. So when I mentioned before that when international government agencies are looking to change up their welfare program, they will almost inevitably book a trip to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and visit our offices over there and see how we run it. Pretty landmark project for us. Another thing we do is child support enforcement. Another really great example of helping government serve the people. So we're working with typically, more often than not, unwed mothers, usually quite young, that are not getting access to child support because the non-custodial parent is not doing their duty. So we provide temporary assistance needy families to these individuals. We have caseworkers or counselors, say, for example, that will meet with the custodial parent to make sure that they're getting all their needs met. That could be getting them access to temporary assistance for needy families, food stamps, daycare when needed, things that will get them over the hump. And then we have legal teams in these offices that do things such as run paternity testing. They will actually provide legal support to sue the custodial parent, non-custodial parent, excuse me. They'll put liens on salary if that's what it takes. But their job is to make sure that the families are getting the money that's owed to them. We talked about consulting. The next 3 or 4 areas there are looking at consulting programs. Program modernization is one we were talking about before, Tommy, that whole idea of how do you take a program that is not being run efficiently right now, and how do we use better technology? How do we create better business process? So those are the programs where we go in, we provide the fix, we give them the solution, and then we get out. Financial services, for those of you that are recent graduates with business backgrounds, that's one of those areas where we've been hiring quite a bit out of college campuses in the last year or two. In fact, there are at least 3 openings right now in Central Virginia in their main office, where these are individuals that will work with typically the CFOs or finance teams from either state or local government agencies around the country. They're working with them typically around budget time to help them determine how they've actually spent federal dollars, federal funding over the previous year, and they develop cost allocation plans that convince the federal government to give them more money in the next budget year. Really interesting work over there. Kind of cost accounting. We provide all that kind of technical training to do it, but it's a client-facing situation where most of those consultants have anywhere between about 10 to 12 clients in a given year. And they're literally the space of Maximus to those clients. That's human services. We've talked about this a little bit, so let me kind of go to the health services slide. So I'm on slide 12 for those of you that are looking at it on the phone. This is the biggest part of our domestic U.S. business these days. So if you look at what we're marketing, those core services, we've talked about this idea of eligibility and enrollment. In Massachusetts, we're going to talk about that a little bit. That's a great example. So enrollment management is basically the idea that if you've ever had to apply for public health care benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, the Children's Health Insurance Program, the individuals or families that are going through that process oftentimes struggle with the idea of understanding the very complicated healthcare language on the actual applications. They have trouble deciphering what the differences are between the 10 or 12 different healthcare that a state could offer to beneficiaries of those programs. Sometimes that's because of language, sometimes that's because of education levels. I look at the fact that, once a year I've got to go through open enrollment. LaDonna and Nick and I all have to do that once a year at Maximus. You haven't gone through it yet, right? Yeah. So we've got 2 healthcare plans to choose from, basically. I have to lock myself in a room. I think I'm reasonably educated. I've been doing this for about 25, 30 years. I lock myself in a room for 3 or 4 hours, review the medical plans, make a decision, and I'm still not sure if I'm making the right decision. So if you've got all these other obstacles that exist to making that healthcare plan choice, who's going to help you? So this is what we do in probably about 18 or 20 different states across the United States. You look at that number up there where it says 1 out of 2 Medicaid managed care beneficiaries is served by Maximus. People have no idea that when they make these calls to get enrolled in the Medicaid plans, calling a 1-800 number, ask questions about the differences between the plans. In those states, they have no idea they're talking to Maximus. They think they're talking to a government representative. That's why it's our job to be invisible, quite frankly. Our clients don't want beneficiaries of these programs to know that Maximus exists. They want people to assume that it's the government that's processing these claims. So enrollment is one of those things we do. We actually get people enrolled into healthcare benefits oftentimes 15 to 20% faster than when the government is doing this, and we're able to do it on a much less expensive financial model as well. We can do things like eligibility determination. That's something we did in the state of Illinois about 5-6 years ago. We ran a program for about 3 years where we took every single person that was currently receiving public health care benefits in the state of Illinois. And we actually worked with the state to determine how many of them should still be receiving benefits. You wouldn't believe how many cases of fraud, waste, and abuse we found in that program. People had died and somebody was still getting the benefits. Yeah, it was wild when they were going through this stuff. They rebucketed people. They found certain people that maybe were in Medicaid, should have been moved into Medicare, areas like that. Okay, so we can do that type of eligibility screening. Outreach and education, I love talking about that. The idea that there's so many people that have access to benefits that don't take advantage of them or don't enroll in them in the first place. So in the state of Texas, we have outreach workers in every single county in Texas. I think it's 50 some odd counties that are actually working with community-based organizations, faith-based organizations to identify individuals that have not enrolled in the benefits plans. The outreach workers will meet with these folks, usually in small groups, educate them on the differences between Medicaid versus the Children's Health Insurance Program, et cetera. And if they haven't signed up for the benefits, they can actually literally enroll them in their computer right there. Other things. We talked about the contact centers. Provider screening. That's another thing we do in several states, is that we can actually do the credentialing background checks in terms of medical providers so that we can create websites that show all the information you might want to know about the doctors in your network. Okay. It's important to note that when we do this type of work, we have no relationship formally with any of the healthcare providers. That's one of the things that we guarantee to our clients, is that we have zero conflict of interest when we've been on this type of work. We sort of manage some of the activities of the providers, but we have no formal relationship with them. And we're not in bed with the healthcare plan organizations in any form or fashion. Any questions about any of that healthcare information stuff? You can see some of the clients, the agencies we typically work with in the bottom left-hand side there. But if you really look at the domestic U.S. business these days and where the largest amount of job opportunities are, it really exists within the health services space.
I have a question.
Of course.
So I see multilingual customer contact centers.
Right.
So is this, you just use the same professionals that speak those other languages that are for citizens here in the U.S. to explain to them what everything else you explained about doing, but in their language? So just translators, basically?
It's individuals that can actually explain the differences and the benefits in any, I think up to about 12 or 13 different languages. If I remember correctly, New York and California are the two states that have the biggest language requirements for our contracts. I think in New York, we have to have reps that can provide those benefits, I think, in up to 14 languages, and I think in California it's 13, if I remember correctly. So it's a big advantage when you're working in these call centers to be able to speak more than one language. And
Okay,
I believe and we in certain cases we have technology that can handle some of the translation. But am I answering your question?
Yes, I was just making sure that this is not referring to something that you're actually working from here with one of the other global centers. Like you mentioned you have in other countries.
Right, correct. Oh, yeah, no, and all this is for the domestic United States, to be clear.
Okay, that was my question, yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that, yeah. Okay. Yeah, when we actually are doing work overseas, it's important to note that we don't push any of our domestic U.S. work overseas. There are no calls and things like that that are being taken in international call centers. The thing to remember that in most of these contracts, I think the thing that's important is that even though these government agencies are outsourcing the work to Maximus, in most cases, we're keeping the work within the state. There are a few exceptions to that. We've been running what we call a shared services model in, Denver, Colorado, Hampton, Virginia, and in Atlanta, Georgia, where since we have significant brick and mortar presence in those areas, we've actually got a number of smaller contracts, say, for example, where it just doesn't make sense to create a brick and mortar shop for maybe 10 customer service reps. So to be more competitive in the bidding, we've been actually saying that we'll create a module or a unit in Georgia or in Denver or in Hampton, Virginia, that will handle these calls, and it creates a more flexible workforce for us, which is great, so that if a contract ends, we're not having to terminate employment. We can move them over to existing contracts within those typical areas. A great question, though. Thank you for asking. Okay, so next slide. We've kind of talked about this already, so let me kind of keep moving along on this. LaDon, I'm going to probably call on you a little bit to talk about this. I'm going to introduce the first slide here. One of the things that we love about Northeastern is that we've got easy access to one of our largest U.S. call centers. That's the Mass Health Customer Contact Center, which is over on 55 Summer Street. Did I get the address right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is 55. Okay. Which is not too far from me, if I remember. About 10 minutes, 15 minutes or
About
something like
10,
that?
15
10,
minutes.
15 minutes, right. You can see the number of staff we have in here. It's pushing 700 staff that work on this particular contract, about 400 plus here in Massachusetts. I didn't know you had any in Virginia. That's news to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that must be in Hampton. Okay,
In
that's
Hampton,
an example.
yeah,
okay,
yeah, that's
so that's an
call
example
center,
of shared services right there.
shared,
Exactly right. So you have multiple contracts under this particular call center. I think it started with the Medicaid program for the state of Massachusetts, and that goes back probably at least 20 years. Some of you may be aware that when Mitt Romney was governor, he was really the first governor to say, "Let's try health care for all." So when he ran when he ran that program, it was actually also administered by Maximus. We were handling all the enrollment and eligibility while it existed. So, but what we found is that this is morphed into several other different types of contracts. You can see some of those functional areas on this part of the screen there, and you can look at the volume. 15,000 plus calls being answered per day exclusively to this contract. And that's going to go up at certain times of the year, obviously during open enrollment, say, for example. So let's, next 2 or 3 things. LaDon, you want to talk about a little bit of this areas where you're comfortable?
Sure. Majority of our employees in that location is call center. We have four floors dedicated to the call center. We have customer service advisors and about 100 and something temp employees we get from 3 separate agencies. Because this location doesn't hire call center representatives directly. We source them to 3 agencies, and they come in. They come in on board with us, and they do the necessary background check because we have to meet certain requirements by the state: background, education, employment, and drug testing. And then we have the different contract we have with them. After 6 months of employment, we can convert them over to our full-time employees. So, of course, during the course of the year now, we convert over like 20 to 30 something employees who are temp employees to our full-time staff. You know, we have a knowledge center that helps with the call center operations for individuals that while they're training, they go to residency 3 to 5 weeks, between 3 to 5 weeks. So individual comes on board and they go through a 2-week training program. We train a program to residency, and after they complete the residency, the supervisors make sure that they're ready to go on and receive calls. We don't do outbound calls. We do inbound calls. All the calls that comes in. You know, so they answer the calls and everything. So, and then the knowledge centers where they have information that individuals need information about specific programs or specific policies that go to the knowledge center to provide them. Because we think that we have about 20 something different policies. And we have a research operation department and a training department where you do update training on a regular basis for the individuals in the call center. And only for the call center individuals, but most of the training, 90% of that training is related to the call center training. And what individuals do is we have individuals, all the positions that we have, we do our basic aim is to promote from within. So most of our individuals in the call center, we have our research operations, our provider relations department, individuals with email blasts, individuals can apply for those positions. So those individuals get preference first before we post it outside.
Yeah, okay, great.
And then we also have a claims department. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I want to kind of go to the more specific things. As we start talking more about jobs, obviously we have plenty of opportunities here in Massachusetts. Some of the openings, if you look at those of you that are recent Northeastern graduates or looking to transition over there, we've got just some of the jobs listed here that we think could be of interest, depending on your background. So if you've got data analytics background, say, for example, we've got needs for business analysts. We've got needs for technology folks with managing some of these website development. We have software engineering opportunities available. We have opportunities in operations management. That's a great fit for somebody with a military background that has supervised individuals, taking advantage of the leadership skills you develop in the military. This is just really a small sample, to be clear, because we've got a lot more opportunities both here in Massachusetts as well as in operations or sites all around the United States these days. So I think somebody was talking about having, somebody mentioned having a political science background. One of the things that we love that background for, there's 2 jobs in Reston, Virginia that we're always hiring new graduates for. One of them is related to business development. We need people with public health care backgrounds, public policy, political science, that can analyze the goings-on of state, local, and federal government agencies, certain regional areas, to figure out how changes in policy are creating opportunities for us to bid on new work. And those analysts are the ones that are convincing management to go after work. I'll give a great example. One of our recent hires from 4 or 5 years ago graduated from Duke, interned for us for 3 months in the summer in our proposal operations area, became a health business development analyst. In his second year on the job, if I remember correctly, he rode up our elevator in headquarters with Bruce Caswell, who was then our chief operating officer, now our CEO, and asked Bruce if we've ever thought about looking at work related to mental health care assessment. We do all this review work, we do independent medical reviews, we do things like in-house assessments, but he had actually noticed that there seemed to be a growing market for, I guess, nurses that need to be able to go and make home visits and determine if people should be remaining in long-term care under mental health reasons. So Bruce got really excited about this, pulled Andrew, the business development analyst, in the office and said, "What are you thinking about?" Andrew said, "Well, I've been doing a little bit of research. There are 3 or 4 small organizations around the country that do this kind of work. Have we ever thought about acquiring any of them?" 6 months later, we acquired an organization called Ascend, based in Nashville, Tennessee, that does exactly that type of work. We've increased their revenues, I think, times 15 in the last 3 to 4 years since we've owned them. All due to the work of a 24-year-old business development analyst right out of college, which I think goes to one of those things that I can't stress enough. For those of you that are recent graduates or getting ready to graduate or thinking about transition, we're not afraid to give somebody brand new to the organization a whole lot of responsibility. So those are just a couple. And I think at this point, I'd love to take the last couple minutes just to talk a little bit more in person with the folks that are here in office. But for those of you that are on the phone, we hope that this has created some ideas about things that you might want to explore a little bit further. What I'd like to do is I'm going to have Nick follow up with Andy to set up some individual appointments for those of you that would like to learn more about some of these individual opportunities that we have, so we can get you matched up with the right hiring managers, the right recruiters, etc. So Nick, if you and Andy can follow up, I know we got to stop in about 2-3 minutes or so. I'm going to stick around individually here for a little bit to answer questions from folks in the room. But are there any questions from anybody on the phone or in the room about anything that we've discussed or haven't discussed yet that try knock down in the next minute and a half?
I have a question, and it's related to what, I'm sorry, I missed his name, the last guy who spoke. Introduces. Yeah. So just to understand, all of these call centers and services that you guys are providing, everything is incoming. You're not soliciting anything out, right? So people contact you. You're not contacting out people. You're not prompting the calls and services.
Yes, so individuals who want to enroll for the Mass Health program, they call us. Individuals who have issues with their providers who want to arrange transportation to and from the doctor, to and from a doctor's visit or a physician visit, they call us directly and we coordinate that for them. Right. Individuals want to call about the eligibility, we handle that situation for them. So individuals don't make any outbound calls.
Right. Okay. There are very few call centers that we run anywhere in the United States that are outbound. The few that I can think of, Nick, didn't the VA program have some outbound calls, like helping people get appointments and things like that?
Yes, that's correct. We were actually calling veterans. Yes.
Right. That was one of them. The other one I know for sure is the student debt management program that I alluded to earlier as well. But off the top of my head, out of all the different call centers we run in the United States, those are the only 2 I can think of that for sure had outbound components to it. Good question. Anybody
Okay,
else? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to go.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
I'm more interested in the VA. I was wondering if there was anybody that I could talk to about uh, recruitment as far as maybe doing some part-time work while I'm still completing my degree.
Right. Absolutely. And we've been encouraging that at more and more business operations around the country, and we're getting a lot of traction there. So that's something that, as I mentioned before, we're going to connect all the folks on the phone with Nick Mills. Shortly,
Okay.
Andy and Nick will send out an email to all of you so that you can get some time on their calendar in the next couple of days to talk about some of these opportunities. So we'll do that
That'd be
individually.
great.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
I should also note that we've also been getting a lot more creative in terms of how we work with disabled veterans in particular, disabled individuals and disabled veterans, and that we've been creating a lot more remote opportunities for individuals with mobility impairments, for people with anxiety disorders. There's tons of reasons out there now why folks can't leave their home, but we've actually been getting much more flexible, whether it's call center operations, whether it's remote situations doing things like business analytics. It's something that we've really been adapting to, in particular, over the last 2 or 3 years or so, and I think we'll continue to see more of that as time goes on. So, okay. Any other questions before the official presentation is done?
Oh, did you hand out some of these listings as you mentioned to the people in there in the hall? Or
yeah, we don't have any literature specific to that, but we'll send out a follow-up email with information about how to apply, and we can actually put together maybe a little sample of some of these types of positions. What I'm more interested in doing is I think the idea of doing the individual job counseling is probably better, so that you can find out really what your needs are, what you're really looking to do. And I think it better advise you as opposed to sending out a plethora of job descriptions that we may or may not fit your individual needs. All right, anything else? I'm sorry for those of you on the phone we couldn't provide you with a virtual lunch, but we'll figure out a way to do that in the future, I guess. Right? That's the next wave of technology. So.
Come on,
Thanks,
Uber
Frank.
Eats.
I'm sorry?
I said Uber Eats. You could have just sent some over.
That's Nick, we got to look into that. That's actually a good point. Let's think about that for next time. Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you all for taking the time.
There's no Uber in New Hampshire.
Fair enough. So thanks all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to future transactions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Questions?